We are continuing on our series of what is the Bible. What is the Bible? It's God's Word. It's a book. When we're looking at it from the standpoint of God's Word, a lot of times we can look at it in such a lofty way that we really don't pay attention to what the document is, but it's a book. It was put together, it's several books together. It was printed, it was written over a period of about 1,400 years by 40 or more authors, but yet it carries the same theme from front to back, all the way from Genesis to Revelation, or what some people say, generations to revolutions. So, so anyway, from Genesis to Revelation. So we're talking about the Bible, and we've been talking about the different sections of the Bible, what each section is and what's included in those sections, and what's written and why it's important to the Bible as a whole. And tonight we're going to be in the history section. What is the history section of the Bible? First, I got a question there. What is history? What's history? What's history? Okay, what's happened in the past? Okay, anybody else? What is history? I like it on the news that somebody will be appointed to an office and it says, or be elected, and it says, we are making history. What does it take to make history? When we came in earlier, 5 minutes ago, is history. Everything that's happened becomes history in this world. Merriam-Webster defines it as the chronological record of significant events such as those affecting a nation or institution, often including an explanation of their causes. And then it says a branch of knowledge that records and explains past events. That does a little better. A branch of knowledge that records and explains past events. And on history.com, the definition they give is the branch of knowledge dealing with past events, a continuous systematic narrative of past events that relating to a particular people, country, period, person, etc. So in other words, all of us have lived through history because everything that's past is history. What was yesterday was history. What was last week was history. What was Sunday was history. All of that is history. Now you could say there are certain things that are significant points in history or more significant than others, but if it's in the past, as far as I'm concerned, it's history. It's something that's past. You can't change history. History is what it is. That's the reason it's so annoying to me when people try to change change the history of our country or of the world and try to update history, if you will. You can't update history. History is history. It's what happened, period. Why should we have an understanding of history? Well, the saying is, if we don't learn from history, we're doomed to repeat it. Well, that's true to a large degree, but history doesn't exactly repeat itself. The things in history kind of repeats itself, and you can tell from that. A lot of times what people forget about our nation is not even 300 years old. And you take that out of the age of civilized world, then you needed a cushion. When you take out of the age of the civilized world of thousands of years, our history is a short period of time, and we have a tendency to forget that. So, but why should we understand history? Why should we have an understanding of history? Why is it important? A lot of people say, I hate history. Well, you're going to live through history. You're going to have history no matter what you like. And what I'm talking about specifically tonight is the section in our Bible that we refer to as this considered the history section of the Bible in the Old Testament. There's a lot of history as far as that goes. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John tells of history. because they tell the history of the life of Jesus, what happened during that particular time. There's books in the New Testament that do. But there's a section in the Old Testament that's called the history section. We have, and well, I'll get to that in just a second. Is the reason for understanding biblical history different and of more importance than just history in general? Yes, no, maybe. Is it more important that we understand the historical section in the Bible? And if yes, what is that difference? You don't have to answer that. When does history start in the Bible? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. When does the history section start in the Bible? That's a tougher question, isn't it? What's the first? Joshua. She hit the nail on the head. We have the Torah. You have your paper. You have your cheat sheet. That's good. I have some more of them up here if anybody wants them. The history section starts with the book of Joshua. You have the first 5 books of the Bible, which is the Torah, the Pentateuch, the history. That's not considered the history because that's from the beginning up to a particular time. But the history that it starts with, in fact, I'll go to the history of the Christian Bible begins with Joshua, the first chapter, first verse. It says, after the death of Moses, the Lord's servant, the Lord spoke to Joshua, son of Nun, who had served Moses. Moses, my servant, is dead. Now you and all the people prepare to cross over the Jordan to the land I am giving the Israelites. I have given you every place where the sole of your foot treads, just as I promised Moses. Okay, well, just a trivia question here. How many times in the Bible was a body of water opened up for somebody to walk through? Well, you're saying Red Sea is one, okay? When they passed into the promised land, when the priests picked up the Ark of the Covenant, and when their feet hit the water, the Jordan River split, and they walked across the Jordan River from the east over to the west side of the Jordan River. So that was, but there was 2 other times in the Bible. This is just trivia. This is just fun. It has nothing to do with what we're talking about tonight. And one of them was Elijah, and the other one was Elisha. Elijah told Elisha, he said, I'm going to be leaving, and you're going to take up where I left off. And he said, I want to see, this is Randy's version of it. Elisha said, I want to see when you're taken up into heaven, and so I'll receive a double portion of anointing. And so they walk up, and it's such a nonchalant thing. The 2 of them walk up together, and Elijah takes off his mantle and drops it down, and the river opens up, and he walks across to the other side. Elisha walks with him. And when Elijah's taken up in the fiery chariot, he drops his mantle, and Elisha picks up the mantle. And he turns around to go back, and he drops the mantle on the river, and it opens up, and he walks through to the other side. So there's 4 times. If you find more than 4, let me know. But there's 4 times that I know of that the body of water was opened up for people to walk across. That's just trivia. But this begins with after the death of Moses. After Moses died is when the history section in the Bible starts. Why is that important that the history portion of the Bible starts there? What's important about that history? Who is it the history of? The Israelites, the Jewish people, the children of Israel, the children of Jacob. It's the 12 sons of Jacob. It's the tribe that are coming. Remember when they went to, when Joseph brought them into Egypt, he settled them in the land of Goshen, and they began to multiply, and by the time 400 and some years later, when they were delivered in the book of Exodus, when they were delivered out, there were several million of those that came from one man's 12 sons and their children. That's prospering pretty good. And we know there was that many of them because in the book of Numbers, it counts how many men of fighting age from 20 years old and up were, and there was about 600 and some thousand of them. So you start adding the women to that, and the males that were under 20 years old, and all the children that would have been involved. We don't know how many there was. People said anywhere from 2 to 4 million of them were. Can you imagine 2 to 4 million people traveling through the wilderness, and you trying to keep up with them? That would be a job. But anyway, it starts here, and it starts with the history. This is when Israel is becoming a nation, and they're returning to the promised land that was given to Abraham, who was their father, who was the original Jew, if you will. It was given to him. And then they're returning to this land. It's been 400 and some years since they've been there, and they're returning, and they have to go there. Guess what? There's people living there. But they're not the people that God wants living there, and they're very ungodly people. So they have to go in and conquer this land. So this is what the nation of Israel becoming a nation in fact. They were slaves in Egypt. Now they're becoming a nation. Hebrew Bible now consists of 3 main sections. It's the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. The prophets section in the Hebrew Bible includes the books that many of the books that we refer to as history. The history of man begins in the first chapter of Genesis. The history of the Bible begins, its history section in the Bible begins with Joshua. Joshua, the first chapter we just read. Why did we begin our history section with Joshua instead of Genesis? I just answered the question, sir. 5 minutes ago. Because it's the history of Israel becoming a nation. So that's the history we're talking about. If you read all the way through the Bible, all the way through the Old Testament, from Joshua all the way through, you're talking about the Jewish people. Every book, every writing that's there is talking about the Jewish people. It's not talking about the Gentiles. It's not talking about the Arabs. It's not talking about anybody except, it's not talking about the Moabites or the Amorites or anybody else. It's talking about the Jewish people. So it's the history of the Jewish people. And that's the reason it begins with the book of Joshua, because it's the history of the Jewish people. And it's significant. What race was Jesus? He was a Jew. How about Matthew? He was a Jew. How about Luke? He wasn't, but anyway. How about Bartholomew, how about all 12 of the apostles, the original 12? They were all Jews. All this had to do with if all the way through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you're still talking about Jews. All the way through. Gentiles did not come in the picture until the book of Acts on the day of Pentecost. It's where it begins, and when the first major conversion, if you will, of Gentiles was in the 10th chapter of the book of Acts. But anyway, we won't talk about that tonight. So when we're talking about this, we're talking about Joshua instead of Genesis, because we're not talking about the history of mankind. We're talking about the history of a division of mankind, and this division is the children of Israel, or the children of Jacob, or the Jews as we know them. Whose history begins in Genesis? We know that. Whose history begins in the book of Joshua? So let's take a brief breakdown here of the book of Joshua. I'm not going to do this through all these books. What books are in the history section? Edna has it written down over there, but for the rest of you, you have Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 King, 2 King, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicle, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. All of those books are in the history section of the Bible. So we're talking about from Joshua all the way through Esther is the last book. So all the way through is the history section of our Bible. And that's what we're talking about tonight. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but Joshua I want to break down a little bit because of a particular reason. It says the conquest, to start with, chapters 1 through 12, and it's the preparation, conquest, and Jericho. Everybody read about Jericho, right? The walls of Jericho come tumbling down. What happened to bring the walls down of Jericho? They marched around it. They blew the trumpets, and on the seventh day, it marched around 7 times, and it fell down. The walls fell down. So anyway, the promised land was given to the Israelites, but they had to go in and conquer it. Why didn't God go in and wipe everybody out and just give the land to them? Why did he do that? Why did he send them in and have them to conquer the land? Once the walls of Jericho came tumbling down, as our song says, what did the people have to do? They had to go into Jericho and they had to conquer the people that were there. Why didn't God just conquer it for them? He knocked the walls down. He could have conquered them all. He could have wiped out every person there, couldn't he? If he wanted to. So why did he have them to go in and do it? Now just think on that one a little bit. The division of the land is chapters 13 through 22, and it says division east of the Jordan, the 13th chapter, division west of the Jordan, 14th through 19th, cities of refuge, 20th chapter, and cities of the Levites, the 21st chapter, and Joshua's farewell address, 23 through 24. Now, I'm going to show you a map to explain what I'm talking about here in the, can you see that map? Okay, this is the Sea of Galilee, okay? This is the River Jordan. This is the Dead Sea. Okay, when they came over, when the children of Israel came over to go into the Promised Land, they came around this way and were coming over, and they had to cross the Jordan to get into Israel. And if you look at all these tribes here, it names the different tribes of Israel and where they settled. Well, notice this. Up here you have Manasseh, and here you have Manasseh. So you have Manasseh on the east side of the Jordan and on the west side of the Jordan. And over here on the east side you have Gad and Reuben. So you have 2.5 tribes that are on this side of Jordan. That's where it was talking about when it said division of the east of Jordan in chapter 13, division of the west in 14 through 19. So the ones at the east of Jordan, let me make this short. They got here to the Promised Land. They're getting prepared to cross the Jordan to go into the Promised Land. Well, these tribes, half of the tribe of Manasseh and the tribe of Gad and the tribe of Reuben said, we like it over here. We want to settle here. So Joshua says, well, I'll make a deal with you. Here's the deal. If you will send your fighting-age men with us to conquer the rest of it on this side for all the other tribes, then you can settle over here. So that's what they did. So we have 3 of the tribes over here and the rest of them over here. Now the first 4 sons of Israel were the sons of Leah, and it was Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Do you see a tribe of Levi? Well, not all of them. There's Levites and there's priests. In order to be a priest, you had to be a Levite, but if you're a Levite, you weren't necessarily a priest. But the tribe of Levi does not have, and I'll cover that in just a minute. But anyway, you see that they have the river here dividing them, and you see these 3 tribes over here are actually 2.5 tribes, and you have these tribes over here. Listen, notice another thing. The children, I'm not going to ask you to name the 12 sons of Israel. Of Jacob. I'm not going to ask you to name them, but just trust me on something. Of course, you know this. Who was the second to the youngest son of Israel? Joseph. You see his name up there?
And Manasseh was his son, correct? And he had another son.
Okay, who was his other son? Ephraim. Joseph had 2 sons. This is Randy's opinion. You can do what you want to with this. Jacob, Israel's favorite son, was Joseph. He made him a coat of many colors. He was his favorite son. The other brothers were jealous because he was the favorite son. He wound up being sold into slavery by his other brothers because he was the favorite son. Well, he was the favorite son. Well, according to the custom of that day, your oldest son got a double portion. The oldest son got twice as much as each one of the others did. That was the way it was. So Reuben was the oldest son. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah were the four oldest sons. The oldest son was Reuben, and Reuben, by birthright, should have gotten the double portion. But in my thinking, Jacob, Israel, wanted Joseph to get a double portion. So what he did, if you look in the 48th, 49th, and 50th chapters of the book of Genesis, you'll find this. What he did, he told Joseph when he was getting close to dying, Jacob and Israel is the same person. He said, Joseph, bring your two sons here so I can bless them. So he brought, the oldest one was Manasseh, the younger one was Ephraim. So he brought them up here to stand in front of Jacob. Well, the one you put your right hand on is the one who's considered the greater blessing, and the left hand is the lesser blessing. So Joseph put Manasseh over here for Jacob to put his right hand on, and put Ephraim over here for his left hand. What does he do? What does Israel do? He crosses his hands. He puts his right hand on Ephraim and puts his left hand on Manasseh. And Joseph said, "You're making him." He said, "This is Randy. Okay, so, trust me, I know what I'm doing." And the greater blessing went to Ephraim, and that's the way it played out through history, is that the greater blessing went to Ephraim. So you don't see Joseph there because you see two tribes that represent Joseph. So Joseph, in essence, got a double portion anyway. His descendants got a double portion when it came to meting out what they received in blessing. So anyway, that's what we're talking about the east side and the west side of Jordan, about dividing them up, and Joshua oversaw all of that. I thought I would do a map here that shows roughly, see this line drawn here? That's roughly where Israel is today. That's the Jordan River. There's the Sea of Galilee, the Dead Sea, Jordan River. And that's kind of the way the tribes were laid out. This is where Israel is today. So you see, Israel really had land promised to it that they still don't have control of to this day, over here on the east side of the Jordan River. And you hear talked about, for instance, right about here, there's a section that comes in like this that they call the occupied West Bank, meaning the west bank of the Jordan River. And the Arabs do not want to consider that to be part of Israel. Well, Israel conquered that because all the Arab countries jumped on them and decided to defeat them, and they took that section of land as well as the Gaza Strip down here and the Golan Heights. I started to say Golan, but it's Golan Heights up here. They took those to create a buffer zone between them and their enemies. And we know that they gave, in a peace treaty, they gave the Gaza Strip back. And as soon as they gave it back, Hamas came in and started firing missiles into Israel. So they shouldn't have given it back. But anyway, the East Bank and half of Jerusalem, or the West Bank and half of Jerusalem, belonged to the Arabs. And you talk about, this is getting off subject, but I like bringing this up. They talk about the Palestinians want their homeland back. The Palestinians have never had a homeland. There's never been a nation of Palestine in the history of the world. The whole area here was called Palestine at one time, and that's what the Romans called it. It has nothing to do with a nation. So there is no nation of Palestine. Before the war where they took this over, where they took the West Bank over, that land was controlled by the nation of Jordan, which is on this side of the Jordan River. So it was the nation of Jordan controlled it. It wasn't controlled by it wasn't that the Israelis came in and took the Palestinians' land away from them. It was land that never belonged to them to start with. And they took it over because they were attacked. So it wasn't, so anyway, I get carried away. Anyway, you can see where Israel is today and the way the tribes laid out. And this is the bigger map of the way the tribes laid out side by side, so you can get an idea of the difference between the two today. And so really, if you want to go back and Israel claim their entire inheritance, they'd still have to get more land than what they have now. Will that ever happen? I have no idea. I don't think it's that important. Then you remember this where it said the cities of refuge? What do you think of a city of refuge was? There was 6 of them appointed in the land. And if you'll notice, they're scattered throughout the tribes. You're kind of on the right track there. If you killed somebody, but it was by accident, the family could come after you and kill you for killing the member of your family, although it wasn't on purpose. It was involuntary manslaughter, we'll call it. Well, if you made it to a city of refuge, they couldn't touch you. So it was a legal mechanism to protect them in their law code, to help protect people that really didn't deserve to be put to death. It was to protect them. So Joshua saw to it that 6 cities were set up. They were called cities of refuge. Then what we're talking about with Levites, the Levites, instead of being given a particular territory, they were given cities that were interspersed throughout all of the land of Israel. Now, why would that be the case? Why would that be the case, you think? What were the Levites' duty? Well, the priesthood were within the Levites, but what was their duty besides that? They had duties that had to do with worship, with the temple, with the sacrifices, different things. They had duties that they had to perform. The priests couldn't do all of that, and the tribe of Levi was appointed to do that. So from time to time, they would have to travel from where they were to Jerusalem, where they would join in whatever their line of duty was, which was set up under King David. And whatever their duty was at this particular time, they would come in and do their service to the temple, and then they go back to their hometown. So what it amounted to is you had the priestly line, not the priests, but the Levites, you had them scattered throughout. So they had the influence of the temple, people that were in charge of the temple. They had that influence in communities all over Israel, instead of just being one place. If all of them were in one tribe, then that was the only place that you would have the chosen that were chosen for the priesthood, because you had to be a descendant of Aaron in order to be of the priesthood, and he happened to be a Levite of the tribe of Levi. So but if you had to go to Jerusalem every time, for every time you had a question or you had an issue needed to be taken care of, you'd have a long way to go. And how did they travel back then? Was it SUVs or pickup trucks, or they mostly walked? They walked about everywhere they went, and they'd ride from time to time. You might have a camel or a donkey or something you'd ride, but most of the time you walked. It was kind of tough travel. But when they were interspersed, and this is partially Randy's opinion, but you can do what you want to with it, it was interspersed. They were interspersed throughout all the tribes. Like here, the tribe of Simeon had one city for the Levites in it. And then Judah, this area here, had several of them because it's a much bigger area. So you had cities in each one that were comprised of Levites, and Levites were supported by the community. Part of the offerings went to the Levites. That's what fed them. That's what took care of them. That's what supported the priesthood. You can read different offerings and things in the book of Leviticus, and we won't get into that. That'll get us bogged down. So, we see what he's talking about in the first book of the history book of the Bible, the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament. There's 39 books. Out of those 39 books, these books here, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther are all the history books. In the Jewish Bible, and I've said this before, but I'll say it again, instead of 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, 1 and 2 Chronicles, you'd have one book. Instead of 1 and 2 Kings, you'd have Kings. Instead of 1 and 2 Chronicles, you had Chronicles. Instead of Ezra and Nehemiah, you had Ezra and Nehemiah, which was one book. And that's the reason the number of books in the Jewish scriptures, I think there's 24 in the Jewish Bible, and there's 39 in our Old Testament. It's not that we have more books, it's that we number them differently than what they do. I've said this a couple of times in this study, like when you get into prophets, the 10 minor prophets, starting with Hosea, run all the way through the end, all those that group of prophets were considered one book, 12 books. So anyway, this is the history section that we're talking about. So now we're going to roughly cover some of the rest of it. Judges, the book of Judges. Why do they call it the book of Judges? What is a judge? Today, what is a judge?
The judicial official that represents the state.
They're supposed to make rulings according to law. That's what they're for. The Supreme Court of the United States, they've got one that they've nominated one now. And the only questions that I would have for this nominee, if it's me, is, are you going to rule according to what the Constitution says? Or are you going to rule according to what you feel and you think is right? If they say, I'm going to rule according to what I feel and think is right, I would say, next. Let's get another one, because your only job is to rule according to the Constitution. Now, you can use past rulings that have been ruled since the Constitution to bolster your case, and you can use other cases that have been brought before the Supreme Court to help bolster what your decision would be. But when it comes down to final analysis, it has to be according to what the Constitution says. That's not what Judges, the book of Judges, were. There was no king in the land at the time of the judges. There was a period of time, several hundred years, that it was ruled over by judges. What's the biggest name you remember out of them would be Samson. Because everybody's heard the story of Samson and Delilah and the things that went on with Samson. Now, he was a judge in this particular. There's many that say, and I think we got it written down here, a lot of people consider Samuel, you got 1st and 2nd Samuel, he was considered one of the last judge of Israel by many, and I have a tendency to agree with them. But anyway, if you look at this, Judges in the English title book refers not to specialized judicial officers, but to leaders in general. These judges led Israel from the end of the conquest of Canaan until the beginning of the monarchy. Until the king was appointed, this is the way they were ruled over, and it was different ones at different times that were appointed. Can you name any of the judges? Deborah was a judge. Some people question that. But Deborah was a judge, okay? Anybody else got one? You don't have to. I'm just asking. There was Samson. You can give Samson. You can cheat. I just said Samson, so it said Samson. There was Gideon. There were several of them that were judges at that time, and they would rise up and God would empower them to protect the people and deliver his people because they didn't have a king. So that's the reason we have the book of Judges that comes in our history section, because they had already come into the promised land. The land had been divided up between all the different tribes. Everything had been established, and after it was established, they began to live in these lands for 100, 200, 300, 400 years. They lived in this land for this particular time, and while they did, they didn't have any government of any kind to live by other than what God had given them, but they didn't have anybody to enforce that government and enforce that law, so they used judges at the time. And you remember in Samuel, the people came to Samuel to say, look, you're a fine fella, but one of these days you're going to die, and we don't trust your sons. This is Randy's version again. We don't trust your sons, so we want you to appoint us a king. And he took it as an insult to him that they didn't trust him, although he had done a fine job for a long time. They didn't trust him. God said, look, they're not speaking up against you. They're talking against me, not against you. Don't worry about that. Give them a king. They want a king, give them a king. So he appointed a king. So before we get to that, we have Ruth. Why would the book of Ruth be in the history section of the Bible? You got Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. You're hitting it, but what is the story? What does the book of Ruth, what story does it tell? Who was her mother-in-law? Naomi. Okay, Naomi, I forgot her husband's name all of a sudden. Anyway, she got married and they moved to the land of Moab. They had 2 sons. The 2 sons got married, and one of the daughters was Ruth. Then her husband died, and both of her sons died. She was left with herself and 2 daughters-in-law, and she said, I'm going back home. I'm going back to Israel. I'm leaving Moab. I'm going back to Israel. So she headed back to Israel, and she told her daughter-in-laws, listen, you don't have to come with me. Life has been tough on me. I've lost a husband. I've lost 2 sons. You've lost your husbands. You don't have to come with me. And the other one went home, but Ruth didn't. She said, you're flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone, and so on. That's where you get that particular phrase. And she said, wherever you go, I will go. So I'm going to go with you into the promised land. So she goes into the promised land. She gets into the promised land, and through a series, I'm not going to tell the whole book of Ruth. It's a fascinating book to do a study in the book of Ruth. Maybe we'll do that sometime, but the book of Ruth is a fascinating book. But she runs into a man named Boaz. What happens in the book of Ruth? Let me read you something out of Matthew to help us understand it. Matthew 1:2, it says, Abraham fathered Isaac. Isaac fathered Jacob. Jacob fathered Judah and his brothers. Judah fathered Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Perez fathered... stories in the Bible to show how forgiving God is. Who was Tamar? No. Tamar, well, now you're talking about a different Tamar. Okay, you're going down to history 400 years. This Tamar was married to Judah's oldest son, and the oldest son died. So Judah said to his second oldest son, you need to have children with your oldest son's ex-wife, so you'll leave a bloodline for him. And he said, well, I won't go into all the details, basically said, I'm not going to do it. So he died. So that left the next one. So Judah said, well, listen, Tamar, you go home and live with your parents for a while, and we'll wait until my third son's old enough, because he's afraid he'd die too. So she goes on home to live with her family, but she's good at math. She gets to adding up years, and she says, this boy's old enough to marry. I don't know why Judah hadn't said anything about it. And Judah comes to town, so she dresses like a prostitute, and he propositions her, and she propositions Tamar, and he says, she said, what will you pay me? And he says, so many sheep. He said, well, look, you don't have any sheep with you. What are you going to give me to as a down payment on all this? And he said, well, I'll give you my signet and I'll give you my staff. She said, it's a deal. Well, he gets back to home, and he sends his servant to go collect his signet and his staff, and can't find the prostitute anywhere. He asked all around, so we don't have any prostitute like that. We don't know what you're talking about. We don't have the foggiest idea. He said, okay. So he goes on back. Well, then he gets word that Tamar is pregnant. He said, this woman had been playing around. She had no business doing this. We need to kill her. She said, I got a suggestion. She said, tell the person that owns this signet and this staff that it's his baby. And Judah said, maybe you should come home with me. So, getting a long way around. But that's who Zerah, and so evidently he married her because he had 2 sons by him. And it says Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Aram. Aaron fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered, in the fish is salmon. You could say the name Salmon, but in Hebrew it's Salma. So Salma fathered Boaz by Rahab. Now who was Rahab? The harlot. So here we have a woman that has a son. The father is her father-in-law, the father of her, and then we have the other one that's the son of a prostitute, Rahab the prostitute. God has a sense of humor, and also He's a forgiving God. He can use anybody to get His job done, and that's what He's doing here. He said, Father Salma fathered Boaz by Rahab. Boaz fathered Obed by Ruth. Obed fathered Jesse. Who was Jesse's son? David, who became the second king of Israel. Who was of the lineage of David? Jesus. So all these people, the reason Ruth is in there in the history section is because it ties together all of what we're talking about here, because it brings the bloodline right on down to King David, and it brings the bloodline down to who Jesus is. I went a long way around to get that, but we got there. Ruth was King David's grandmother. Then we get 1 and 2 Samuel. 1 Samuel establishes the monarchy. In other words, he's the first king, King Saul. He establishes the first king because God told him to anoint Saul. Why did He tell him to anoint Saul? Because Saul was a head and shoulders taller than everybody. He looked like a king. So God had him to appoint somebody who looked like a king. How good was he? He turned out not to be so good. And the next one was King David. 2 Samuel records when David became king. I'm getting close here. 1 and 2 Kings records the history of the kings of Israel who followed King David. In fact, King David is dying at the first Kings, and then he appoints the kings that come after him is the ones you'll read about in 1 and 2 Kings. Then 1 and 2 Chronicles is interesting because Chronicles starts back with Adam and goes all the way through to Cyrus of Persia, wherever they were in captivity. So in other words, it rehashes all the history of the Jewish people starting back from the time of Adam right on through. So there's a reason for that, I think. So I put a question here. Why would the Bible include both Kings and Chronicles if both tell much the same story? Why would it do that? Why would you have 1st, 2nd Kings, then 1st, 2nd Chronicles right after it? Well, first place I'll tell you, 1st and 2nd Kings is in more of the history section in the Jewish Bible, but 1st and 2nd Chronicles is in the writings. It's not in with the history section like that is. And here is part of the reason. Together with the books of Samuel, Kings was written from about 550 to 560 BC during the Babylonian exile, while Chronicles was written after the exile was over around 450 to 440 BC, whereas Samuel Kings addressed the hard-hearted Jews experiencing exile and captivity. Chronicles seeks to inspire hope and faith in God among those who are hurting after this spiritual devastating ordeal. If you read 1st and 2nd Kings and you read 1st and 2nd Chronicles, in Chronicles you don't read the bad things the kings do. And most all the kings that it talks about are the kings of Judah. And this is, we won't go all the way back with this, but the kingdom of Israel split into two after Solomon's death, with Rehoboam being the king of the Judah, the southern kingdom, and Jeroboam being the king of the northern kingdom, and it split. And this, when we're talking about here, this, so that the southern kingdom is who most of the kings are that are in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So it's written, to me, it's written as more of a more than just a history. It's written to encourage them and show them the good things about their kingdom, of their nation, of their race, and who they were, to help them through a particular time that they were going through in history. You could read all this. It has to deal about the fact that the two accounts of Israel are different. So down at the last, it says, his people, Chronicles, wanted to encourage the Israelites and help them turn back to worshiping Yahweh as the one true God. Then we get to Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. They're the last three books in the history section. The last three books. And they happen at a particular period of time. And they're what they call the post-exilic books. They happen after the exile. After the children of Israel are coming back to Israel. If you read in Ezra and Nehemiah, they were sent back to rebuild the city of Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, and that's what they did. So why is Esther included? Why is Esther included with those three?
Because Esther was the one that, when they were going to try to wipe out the Jews altogether,
But why was she in a position to help?
because she was married to the king of Persia,
How did she wind up being married to the king of Persia?
and put her in the right spot.
How did she? Well, why did he? Why was he looking for a wife?
Because he got rid of his wife for showing up in Persia.
He threw a big shindig. He threw a big party, and he had all these nobles and everything out there. And he said, "I've got a beautiful wife. I'm going to show off my beautiful wife to all them." So he sent for her. She said, "Are you out of your head? I'm not going to go out there to be used as a trophy." Now that's Randy's. If I wrote the Bible, I'd write it different than the way it is, but that's pretty much what he said. And so he said, "Time for me to look for another wife." So he started looking, and Mordecai put his niece Esther up, who was a beautiful woman. She wound up marrying him and wound up in a position to save the Jewish race. So she saved the Jewish race. I've got. I don't know how well you can see this. This shows, if you look how, let's see, where I want to start. Fall of Jerusalem, Belshazzar, Cyrus. When Cyrus, Darius, the temple was completed here in 517. Then you see Esther was made queen in 480. Xerxes, it says Xerxes the first. In the Bible, it calls him Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus was a title was Xerxes. Ahasuerus was probably his name, and Xerxes was his title. So she became the queen here. And then you'll see you had Artaxerxes in 465. Then you have Nehemiah. Nehemiah returns. You have Ezra up here right after Artaxerxes, because he's the one that gave them the permission to go back and rebuild the temple. Is that confusing, or is that I'm trying to get this in a hurry so you can get an encapsulated idea of how much trouble God went to preserve his people, his chosen people on this earth. If they had not have been preserved, Jesus would have never come to this world.
The day that they were supposed to be wiped out is a holiday
Yes.
called Purim.
Mm-hmm.
That's tomorrow.
That's right. Or actually, Purim, I think is the way they pronounce it, but it's either way. You could be right and I could be wrong. I don't. But they have a holiday that they celebrate because of their deliverance that was done because of Esther, because of what she did. So she winds up in the history section as well. So Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther are referred to as the post-exilic books. Esther is the last book in the history section of the Bible. Ezra and Nehemiah are instrumental in restoring Jerusalem and the temple. And I said, why is Esther included in that section? And we just talked about it, why it was. Do you have any questions or comments? It is 7:58. I did pretty good. I don't expect anybody to remember everything that I said in there. What I want you to remember is the history section of the Bible. So that when you're looking at, if somebody says something about the book of Esther, you'll know where it is and why it is. If you don't know that that's in the history section, you won't know why it's in the Bible. You won't know why it's where it is in the Bible. But when you do, then you can understand the plan of God, how exact and how detailed God was in his plan, and how he went through the Old Testament, through the Jewish people, to get Jesus into the world. He went to a lot of trouble to save us, is what it amounted to. And you can see that through that. And that's in the history section. Any questions or comments?